Alright, so this is my APUSH interview project, and this is my grandfather, Sidney Policier. So we'll start off with parents and family questions. So when and where were you born?
I was born in New Orleans in 1939. 38.
38.
38, let's be true.
And what were your parents' names?
My dad's name was Edward Pellissier, and my mother's name was Marie-Élise Pellissier.
Alright, where was your family originally from?
Originally they were from France, but my father and mother were born in the United States.
Mm. Were they born in different places?
No, they were born in New Orleans.
Okay. What were your parents' jobs?
My mother was a homemaker, and my father was a laborer. He worked a number of different jobs. Before I was the fifth child, and so by the time I came, it was the end of the Depression, and my father had been working as a grass cutter on a gang, and he drove a beer wagon for Anheuser-Busch, we know, with big horses, and he was just a very hard-working, simple guy.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever help with your family income? Did you ever contribute to it?
Yes, it was really interesting. It was mortifying and interesting that my dad wanted us all five of us, to be self-sufficient and to know what it was like to meet the public and deal with the public. So he bought a truck that we called the Red Devil, and in the Red Devil he got mops and brooms from Lighthouse of the Blind, and on the weekends he would drive me to certain areas of town, and my job was to sell brooms and mops door to door. And I resisted that. I didn't like that idea. But I was a cute little kid, and I did really well. I cleaned up on brooms and mops.
Alright, do you remember anything about your grandparents, such as jobs, personalities, traditions?
Well, because I'm the youngest of 5 children, my grandparents were, I remember my father's mother. She was the only grandparent I had of the 4 who was still alive. And she was a really, almost like a caricature of an old French woman. And she had raised 9 children, 7 of them being boys. And so she was like a drill sergeant. And I remember, she died when I was 7, almost 8 years old. So I remember her funeral, and I remember specifically seeing her in the funeral parlor, and there were fans going, overhead fans. It was very hot in New Orleans. And it looked to me like she was breathing because the veils around her were moving. And so I mentioned that to my dad, and he said, "No, boy, she's dead." So that's...
Do you remember what her job was?
Well, she was a housewife, essentially. She stayed home. And see, that's the story of my father. He was in 2nd grade when he was pulled out of school to go sell newspapers and shine shoes. All the boys in the family went to work to support the family. So he was uneducated, and I did not know until I was in my 20s that my father was illiterate. He could write his name. He could read big, maybe headlines in newspapers, but he never read anything. And consequently, he felt compelled to have his children become as educated as possible. So of his 5 children, 3 of us ended up with advanced graduate degrees. So he really stressed education.
Okay, so in your community, did you grow up in New Orleans?
I grew up in New Orleans.
Can you describe your community a little bit, what it was like?
Sure. It was an inner city community, and so it was racially mixed, and I lived with my family in a rental home until I was 13, and the neighborhood was ethnically very rich. We lived half house. You know what that means, half house?
I do not.
Okay, it's a duplex, a shotgun house with room after room after room, ending with a bathroom. And that's one half of the house. And the other half was a Greek family, and their last name was Bombeles. So I heard fights and screaming and praying in Greek. And then on the next house over had a really eccentric group of people. They were English, they were American English, and half house with them were some Spanish-speaking people. And so it was in the neighborhood. It was just across the street there was an Italian-speaking family. And I grew up just understanding that the world was filled with all different kinds of people.
Were there shops by your house that you went to regularly?
Yes, in fact, it was during World War II that I was the youngest kid at home, so I ran a lot of errands for everybody. And we were living on ration stamps. You know what that is?
Yeah.
Okay, so during the war, each family was entitled to only a certain quantity of things. And they would send me, because I was the cute little kid, and they would kind of make exceptions for me. So we had a fresh fish market, a seafood market down the street, and on the corner of our street, which had a very strange name, Dauchenois was the name of it, very French, there was a bakery run by a man named Picou. And Picou's bakery was open all night. Every night they made their own bread and donuts and wonderful smelling stuff. And because it was New Orleans and there was no air conditioning, those doors were always wide open. So there was always the smell of fresh baked goods going on. And then there were a couple of supermarkets and dress shops and you know what a 5 and 10 is?
I do not.
Okay, a 5 and 10 is an early form of Walmart. It was a store that sold notions, all different kinds of things, and generally under $1. It wasn't 5 cents and 10 cents, but it was close. And so that's where you went to get socks and underwear and things like that.
Okay, what was
the best?
Oh, sorry.
The best place. Sorry, the best place was a real ice cream parlor with wire tables and chairs, and you could go to the ice cream parlor, and for a nickel, you could get an ice cream, a
That's
dish
cheap.
of ice cream. Yeah, that's cheap, but a nickel was hard to come by.
Yeah. Okay, what was the largest city you visited as a kid?
As a kid, well, we didn't do a lot of traveling. My family didn't. My family was not exactly poverty-stricken, but they were really poor. They were living on a laborer's income, and there were many of us to feed. So we didn't do a lot of traveling. I did when my oldest sister got married. I went to Lynchburg, Virginia, alone on the train, which was a big adventure. I was 10 at the time. But we did not do a lot of visiting.
Do you remember anything about Lynchburg?
I remember meeting my sister's in-laws, and they were very proper and I thought stiff, and very, very well-mannered people. And I had grown up with manners. We had manners pounded into us. You know, we were Southern kids, and you said yes, ma'am, and no, sir, and you addressed people by, if you knew them very well, you could call them by their first name, but with Mr. or Miss in front of it. And so I had good manners, but I sounded like I came from the inner city. Have you ever seen the movie My Cousin Vinny?
No, I haven't.
Oh, you haven't seen My Cousin Vinny? Well, Vinny is a guy who kind of talks like this, and I kind of talk like that. And I didn't know I talked like that until I was a college student. And I found out that I had a terrible accent because I had tried out for a play. And when you try out for a play, you really have a good sense of how you're doing. I got called back twice. And then finally the director phoned me and he said, Sidney, I was a freshman at the time. He said, Sidney, I think you have a lot of possibility for doing theater, and I'm going to do you a favor and tell you that you're not going to get cast in any university productions until you learn how to speak English. And I was really shocked because my English was very correct. It just sounded like I had just gotten out of the mafia. Okay, so I had to take some diction lessons.
Okay, so moving into the school category, what was school like for you, like as a kid?
School was wonderful. I loved school because it was, I loved learning. I was a smart guy, and I came fifth in line following, two older brothers and two older sisters who were valedictorians and, all really, really good at what they did. And luckily, I got born with a lot of native intelligence. That's not bragging, that's just an observation, that's a fact. So I aced school. School was really, it was a good experience for me.
Did you have any dislikes with schooling?
Yeah, the dislikes that I had, well, you're going to be interested in this. I disliked very intensely the organized sports in school because I had vision problems that I didn't know were problems at the time. But I couldn't catch a ball because I had double vision. And when a ball was coming at me, I saw two of them, and then merged into one and then two. And I never knew which one was the real one and which was the image. And so when anyone threw a baseball at me, I went, this. Okay. So I was an object of a lot of mockery, let's put it that way. And so I really didn't like going to gym classes. But laws of physics were in my favor. I was a really fat kid, really big kid. And I didn't like to fight, but when pushed, I did. So.
What were your favorite and least favorite subjects in school? Gym was probably your least favorite.
Gym was kind of my least favorite subject. I really liked all the academic subjects. I wasn't so keen on science, but there wasn't that much science being taught. I had great language skills, and so, I ended up later going on to the PhD in liberal arts. So, those kinds of subjects were really my favorites.
Yeah. Were there music classes at your school?
Yes, there were. And in fact, there was a big music, a business in New Orleans called Werline's Music Shop, I believe. And they sent out representatives to all the grammar schools in New Orleans trying to recruit kids to learn instruments. And of course, I jumped on the notion, that appealed to me, and I wanted to try cello for some reason. And I went home and my brothers ragged on me and said, they're going to beat you up when you get on the bus carrying a cello. So I said, well, let's do piano. And because I knew I didn't have to take the piano on my back, okay? So I ended up with a piano, and it turned out that I had some talent for piano. And I started studying when I was taking lessons when I was about 10. And by the time I was 12 years old, the music teacher I had told me and told my family, I can't teach Sydney anymore. He has begun to pass me in some ways. So she set me up with an interview at Newcomb College. Tulane is a university in New Orleans, and Sophie Newcomb College was the music school and the girls' college. So I went and auditioned when I was, right before I was 13, and I was given a full ride scholarship to study piano at Sophie Newcomb. And I went on. I studied for 3 years, and when I was late in my junior year of high school, my music teacher, she was just a marvelous teacher. She was supposed to teach me 1/2 hour twice a week, and I would go and sometimes be there for 3 hours, 3.5 hours. She was just really grooming me. And she set me up to play in a recital, and I thought she was being very picky about what I played and etc. But, you know, I went with what she chose, and it turned out that she had me play an Afro-Cuban very dissonant sonata that sounded like a headache to my family. Is what it sounded like. Anyway, I played this, and very percussive piece, and the man who was the composer happened to be, he had been invited to hear me and some other students, and he talked to me and asked me what I thought of this piece called Chacona, and I said, it's interesting, I really like it, but there are mistakes in the manuscript. And he said, yeah, show me where you think the mistakes are. And it was all very dissonant, but it seemed to me that there was one quiet passage where there were some sharps that had been printed as sharps, and I thought they should be naturals. And I pointed that out to him, and he said, yes, that is a mistake. That's a printing error. And it turned out that he offered me a scholarship the next year to go to Juilliard's, where he taught. And I didn't take him up on that. I wasn't sure I wanted to be a musician at the time. But that was in my background.
All right. Did you do any extracurricular activities in school, like clubs?
Yeah, I was in, you know, a number of, I can't remember all of the clubs at this point, it's been a long time, but I was in a lot of the honors clubs because I was a top-level student, so I got steered into this and that, and went ahead and did it. I was a star Spanish student, okay, and Señorita de Milt was her name. She put me into this Spanish club and into some citywide competitions, and I came out with high ratings on all those things. So she was convinced that I was destined to become a Spanish professor somewhere, and I was just you know, trying to humor her and do my thing. So I did.
Okay, moving into your teenage years, did you have conflict with your parents or your family members, and if so, about what?
Well, that's a loaded question. Because my siblings were so much older than I am, my next brother in age, the closest to me, was 7 years older. So when I was a teenager, he was in his early 20s. And my older sister was 16 years older than I was. So I had some conflicts with them because they all felt like they were my boss. And in effect, they really were. They took care of me. But that was a source of conflict. So I didn't have conflict with my father, although I was difficult for him because everyone else, all of my siblings, felt more cowed by, they felt cowed by him, and I respected him, but I didn't, when he said jump, I wanted to know why and how high, and that drove him crazy. My father believed that when he told you to do something, you did it. And I did do what he told me to do, but not graciously always.
All right. Did you have a lot of friends?
Yes.
Did you have like more boyfriends or more
I
girlfriends?
had boys and girl friends. Yeah.
Did you spend a lot of time with them?
Yeah, a lot. You know, that's a relative term. Even as a young kid, when I was growing up in the inner city in New Orleans, my family, when I wasn't in school, they turned me out on the street after breakfast in the morning, and all the other families did that too. You know, everyone was outside, and you weren't at risk the way kids would be at risk today. If you put an 8-year-old out in the street and said, "Come back for dinner," you know, you'd be worried about that. But that was the norm. And, you know, recently, not too long ago, Hillary Clinton wrote that book, It Takes a Village. And basically her idea is that each of us is raised by a whole community. And I was. So if I went 3 blocks away from home, the neighbors down the street knew who I was, and if I did anything that I shouldn't be doing, which I often did, it got back to my dad, and then I had hell to pay.
Like, what were those things that you did wrong?
This is a public interview. I don't think I can. Well, I did some things that were not completely honest. For example, a couple of friends and I used to steal fruit from peach trees in the neighborhood. I know that the families knew that we were taking the fruit. They had several trees and they couldn't eat all those peaches. Anyway, we appropriated peaches and we sold them on the corners for, this was the dishonesty, and I got reported on this. We sold them for a penny a piece, or 4 for a nickel. And most of the customers weren't too bright, so they bought nickels worth. And so my dad found out about that, and he told me, you know, you go to jail for doing things like that, boy.
Do you remember anything else that you did with your friends besides peaches?
Oh, yeah. We would have, you know, long days of free time. We would put on roller skates and skate about 3 miles down a big avenue called Esplanade, and we'd go to City Park and skate through the park all day long, or we would take fishing poles and go to Bayou St. John and catch fish and crabs, and those are the kinds of things that we did. I didn't do a lot of, we played kickball and things like that in the streets, but I didn't do a lot of organized sports.
Okay, when did you begin dating? Like, at what age?
Pretty early, around 15. And it was an interesting thing because I was, in some ways I was a shy kid, but I was a popular kid, and little girls liked me a lot, which was that was an advantage that I enjoyed, and so I had dates.
Where'd you go on dates? Do you remember?
Well, yeah, to movies, to, you know, sports events at school, that kind of thing. The first formal date that I had, I was just turning 16. And I had been given some complimentary tickets to a Mardi Gras ball by a great aunt of mine. And so we were going to a ball. And the ball was, you know, formal wear. I wore a summer tux, and my date wore a gown, and I got her a corsage to wear on her wrist. And I thought I was going to punch the lights out of her because when she was getting in the car, she pulled in her skirt and in the cab because I couldn't drive. And I said, "May I close the door?" And she said, "Yes." And I closed the door, and the orchid on her wrist corsage got snapped off in the door. And so I had to be a gentleman and act like that was okay. So we were going to the municipal auditorium for this ball, and we were really cute little kids. And the cab driver mentioned that to us, you know, how sweet we were, and that I remember being really outraged that he said that.
And you said that you didn't have a driver's license at that time. Did you ever get it?
Oh yeah, I got my driver's license late. But here's a story about your great-grandfather. He would not sign for me to have a driver's license.
Why was that?
He said I would be reckless if I had a driver's license. So he would let me use the family car, which was an old Chevrolet that he took great care of. And he told me that if I got stopped for speeding, or if I had any kind of difficulty with the police, he was going to tell them that I had taken the car without his permission.
It's kind of mean.
Well, it was very effective. I was so cautious when I was driving.
All right, going into education and career, where did you go to college, and why did you choose that college over others?
Okay. I had scholarships to go to Juilliard's for music, and also to Indiana University in Bloomington for music. These were music-related awards that I got. And I decided that I didn't want to be a musician, I wanted to be an architect. So I thought, well, I'll get out of high school and I'll work a little while and then I'll go to some school for architecture. And my dad said, absolutely not. Boy, you're going, you're going to college. So he had my next brother, my brother Charlie, drive me to Baton Rouge to go to school. It was a state school. And I qualified to go there because of my academic record. And I got a legislative scholarship to go. And I was in the ROTC, and so the ROTC it had a little financial award with it, so it was like a scholarship for undergrads. And when I was leaving to go to school, my dad gave me $200. And he said, this is a loan, and you need to pay it back to me, but not with interest. So he felt like he was not able to send my older siblings to college because there were too many of them at the same time. And then by the time I came along, I was and am the baby of that clan. He told me, he said, I couldn't give this to your brothers and sisters, so I'm not going to give it to you. And he could have afforded to send me to school because by then he was earning more money and etc. Anyway, and I thought that was really unfair of him. I felt put upon. But as it turned out, it was a gift to get me to be self-sufficient. I could do it, and I did it. I worked my way through undergrad school and with the ROTC, and I worked as a busboy in a girls' cafeteria. Okay. So as a busboy in the girls' cafeteria, I bussed tables, and I had lots of invitations to sorority dances and such to go as an escort. Okay, so I kept a suit coat and my summer tux jacket at the ready. So during my first year of graduate school in French, here's the deal. I thought I knew nothing at all about French graduate work. I thought you went to graduate school in French to learn French. And they felt that you knew French before you started graduate school. So you were supposed to be writing papers in French and reading everything in French. And I was the village idiot in the group. But I worked really hard, and at mid-year I applied for a scholarship to go study in France, and also one in Italy, and I got them both. And I chose the French one because I wanted to finish my master's degree in French. So I went to Paris for a year and studied at the Sorbonne and got a degree from the French University and came back to graduate school in Baton Rouge and finished my master's degree in French. During my last year of the master's program, I married Nani, okay, your grandmother. And she was still in graduate school, and I was finished, I thought, and I was advised to continue toward the PhD while my wife was finishing her master's degree. So I stayed another year and finished coursework, and then I was invited in by the department head, who said, "Look, Sidney, you're essentially ready for the PhD. You've done all of our coursework, you've written a master's thesis. Why don't you stay for a year and plan a dissertation topic and get going on that?" So I said, "Yes, sir," and I did that, and push comes to shove, I finished with a PhD in hand when I was 27, and went from Baton Rouge to a job in Fayetteville, Arkansas, at the University of Arkansas. And while I was there during my first year, I wrote a proposal for national defense funding, and got a language institute set up in Arkansas for French and Spanish high school teachers. And that was a big success, and brought money to the university, and I got a call from Purdue University saying, "We would like you to come for a visit," and that they were interested in me. And I declined. I said I didn't want to do it because by that time we had 2 infant children, and we had just moved the year before. And besides, one of the big attractions for me in the job at Arkansas was that there was an MFA program, Master of Fine Arts program, and in the MFA, the people who were teaching were not academics, they were professionals. Courses taught by dancers who had danced with Martha Graham's company, and theater producers, etc. Real musicians, real performers. And I had been a performer all through undergraduate school and graduate school too. So I had done a lot of theater, and I loved doing the theater at University of Arkansas. So I told the gentleman who phoned and invited me to come for an interview that the thing that was really holding me in Arkansas was the arts program. And he said, "Well, at Purdue, we have professional theater, and I will arrange, if you come for a campus interview, I'll arrange for you to do auditions over in the theater school," which he did. And I came and I got the job at Purdue, and I got offers to do semi-professional theater in Purdue's summer company, which I ended up doing for 7 consecutive summers when I was a young guy. I also got an offer to go to University of South Carolina and be part of their French faculty, because the guy who was interviewing me for Purdue was leaving to go to be department head in South Carolina. So he offered me the job at Purdue, and he said that this is not completely ethical, but I want you to know that if ever you want a job at University of South Carolina, including next year, you're welcome to come. So I came to Purdue and got 2 different job offers. And the appealing thing about Purdue, where I stayed for the rest of my academic career, was that I was given permission and a lot of leeway to teach outside of the language department. So I taught in the English honors program. I worked on projects with Purdue theater faculty. I was an acting coach and taught body movement, and did a lot of performance as a young guy at Purdue. I was faculty, but I was performing in student productions. And so and having 2 children at home, and Nani had a good job as a social worker in Lafayette, Indiana. So we ended up just staying there. And that's where I live now. I retired in 2003 and decided we liked the community so well we just stayed put.
That's nice. So moving into your marriage with Nani, you said you met her in graduate school?
No, I didn't. She was in graduate school when we got married. I met her at that girls' cafeteria that I told you about a while back, and she was one of the girls who our staff consisted of the boys and the girls, and the girls did nice jobs like checked off names when people came through the cafeteria line, and the boys did things like bus tables and mop floors and that kind of thing. Well, we became great friends working at the cafeteria, and we dated on and off for several years. 5 years before we figured out that we were in love and we were going to get married. So we ended up getting married when I came back from France.
When was that?
That was in 1962, and I was 23 years old, and my father was already worried about me because I was 5 years past marrying age. You know, all of my cohorts married right after they got out of high school, and I didn't. So we got married and started having babies.
And how many children did you have?
We started off wanting 6, but we stopped at 2. We thought 2 was all we could stand, all we could manage, actually, because we were both graduate students, and I was on fellowship and an assistantship, and it still wasn't quite enough money to raise children on. So I worked as a tour guide. I worked as a French-speaking tour guide for tourists coming to Baton Rouge, Louisiana from Quebec. So on Saturdays, I would give these tours. I didn't have time to learn all of this voluminous information about all of the history of all of the houses and sites in Baton Rouge. So I used my theater skills and a few facts to embroider these very fanciful stories. And I always got about 50 or 60 bucks a week in tips, which probably doesn't sound like much to you, but the rent for our apartment that we lived in was $60 a month. So one Saturday would pay for the rent. And then if I had 2 or 3 Saturdays during the month, it was good. It was good.
When did you decide to move in with Nenny?
In our day, nice girls didn't move in with anybody, okay? And Nenny was really a nice girl, darn it, but she was. And we decided to get married. We were going to get married in Paris when I was there as a student. So I stayed for the summer, for the fall and spring semesters. She came over during what would have been summer school for her, and we were going to get married and have our honeymoon in Europe. So when she came over and we applied for the wedding license in France, I qualified to get married as a foreigner in France because I had been there for more than 90 days, but she had not. So we couldn't get a marriage license. So truth be told, that's when Nani stopped being a nice girl, and we had a honeymoon before we got married. We got married when we came back in 1962.
Wow.
Wow, yeah. Family skeletons.
So your 2 children, what were their relationships with each other growing up?
Well, you know what their relationship is now. It was pretty much the same. They're 18 months apart, and they're very different people, but they love each other. They really do.
Were they in like different friend groups?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Your mother is our youngest daughter, and she was more academic, and she was a very spirited, gung-ho. She was into everything and really identified with school activities. And your Aunt Coco Colette was more of an independent type, and she didn't rank high in the popularity scales, but she was and is a very beautiful, physically beautiful person, and so she was academically very bright, but not as talented academically as your mom. But then it wasn't really her priority either. She didn't push for that.
Yeah.
Okay.
With your children, what are the best and worst parts of raising children?
The best part is being able to witness their development and to play a part in that. The worst part was not knowing how to do it. Kids don't come with a user's manual. And when you have very different personalities to deal with, you really have to figure out how to deal with those personalities appropriately. But we loved both of our girls, and I think we did a good job with them, but it wasn't easy. It wasn't always easy.
Did your parents help with, the raising of your children?
Oh, not at all. Well, my mother died. She died while we were pregnant for Colette, your aunt. So they never met my mother. My dad was still alive, and they knew him pretty well. And he came to visit us and live with us in Lafayette, Indiana. But how do I explain this to you? It wasn't through indifference, but it just wasn't customary in my generation, and especially in my social class, for parents to help.
Yeah.
Like when our daughters were moving, we went and packed boxes and helped them move boxes and painted walls for them and did all of that stuff. But that never happened coming from my family. And it wasn't just for me that it didn't happen. It didn't happen for my brothers or sisters. That just was not an expectation.
Okay, so moving on, did you participate in any movements in the 1900s, such as like the Civil Rights Movement, or?
Yes. I wasn't an activist, but there was no way to be alive in the 1960s and to be intellectual, which I am, and not be involved in movements. I did I don't want to exaggerate here, I was involved in protests and sit-ins where we were physically removed from the student union and such. And I did those kinds of things. And something that you might be interested in, there was this phenomenon called streaking. Do you know what
yes, I do know what streaking is.
Okay. Okay, so that. Okay.
All right. Did you know anyone that was like close to you that served in a war?
Yes.
Is there like any of them that like stick out to you? Any specific one?
Well, some of my brother's cohorts, my brothers are 7 and 9 years older than I was. They had high school friends and college friends who went off to serve in Korea and in Vietnam. But I didn't have any active service. Because of my age and because it depends on when you're born whether or not you get involved. It's a chronological thing. By the time I was eligible to be drafted, I was academically plowing ahead, and not to avoid the draft, but it just was that I was a good student, and good students were not drafted. And then when I first got married, we had our first child within the year. of our marriage. Colette was born, we got married in September. Colette was born in July, and that made me ineligible for the draft on two counts. I was academically successful, and I was in a field that foreign languages were very favored fields and necessary because of the age of Sputnik, when the Russians went into space before we did. Language schools had great cachet. And so because I was in that field, I was relegated to a very low draft status. And then by the time I finished the PhD and I had 2 children who were preschool age, and I was 27, I was considered too old to go into the military.
All right. Do you remember your first contact with the television, radio, computer, phone, etc.?
Oh, of course, yes. This will probably surprise you. I took a computer programming course in the 1990s, and I had many years of experience as a college professor, no experience with computers. And the university was giving in-house training to professors to bring us into the computer age. So I saw my first computer in a computer programming course when I was born in '38, so I must have been past 50. And we were in a computer lab, and there were assistants to help the professors, because this was training for the needy, okay? And I was very needy, and I put my hand up and I said, "Can someone show me how to turn this thing on?" I had no idea, and it was because it was a model that didn't have an on-off switch. You had to reach under and behind it and reach up to get the thing to start. So I just plowed into it and learned by doing, and went through about 6 months of computer training, and was able to program multiple versions of tests for large population courses. I was in charge of the first 4 semesters of French language at Purdue, so I was able to program courses that had, say, multiple versions of several of the questions, and ways to scramble the answers so that people who took the test at 10:30 couldn't give the answers to people taking the test at 11:30. If they could give them the answers, but they would be wrong. So that computing skill came in very late.
Yeah.
Very late.
All right. You said that you speak French as well as English. Are there any other languages that you speak, or
yeah. When I did my master's degree, the rule was that you had to do 2 languages, 2 Romance languages. So my major was French, so I took Italian as my second language. And then when I did the PhD, you had, besides your first language, you had to have master's level competence in another Romance language. So I added Spanish, and then I needed to learn German to pass reading knowledge exams. And I have a lot of, I have high competency in foreign languages, so I could add languages. It was work, but it was just a matter of doing it. And I had grown up in the Catholic Church, and so I already had exposure to Latin. And in graduate school, you had to take what was called Vulgar Latin, and that means the vox populi, the Latin that was spoken by uneducated people. And so that's what gave birth to the various Romance languages. So I had to do Vulgar Latin and Latin. I did not have to do Greek, and I kind of regret that I don't know Greek, especially since I've been caught in Greece wondering what the street signs say and that kind of thing. So several languages.
Yeah. Do you know how your family first came to the United States?
I do. My mother's father, for whom I'm named, was a doctor. And that kind of runs in the family too,
Yeah.
right? And he was born in Paris, and he came to New Orleans as a young man, and he had a very successful career in New Orleans. He became the director of the Board of Health. Mm-hmm. So that was a very prestigious place for him. My mother's family, that was my mother's family. My father's family came from, originally from Marseille, that's southern France, and they migrated to New Orleans, to the Bayou country, where the Cajuns live.
Yeah.
And they came in the mid-19th century. My mother and father both spoke French as native languages, but my mother's French was cultivated. It was what we would call Parisian French. And my dad spoke French. I suppose the equivalent would be like an uneducated Appalachian. Okay, so he spoke Cajun French. And my mother couldn't stand it, so they didn't speak French together. They opted for English, since they were both bilingual.
Yeah.
And I heard French when there was a screaming fight, or when they were praying. I learned my prayers in French. I didn't know what that was. I didn't know it was French. I just thought that's the way you prayed.
Yeah.
And it was a big advantage to me, because when I went to graduate school and started learning French, well, I had 16 hours in undergrad school, picked it up like that.
Yeah.
I had the phonology built into me. I knew those were not foreign sounds. I knew what they were. I could make them. And so when I speak French now, I'm slightly accented, but it's academic accent. It's not American. They'll ask me in France, what part of Canada are you from? They know I'm not French, but they can't place where I'm coming from.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so growing up, were there holidays that were more celebrated compared to others, or that were more serious for your family?
The holidays in my family, such as Christmas, were really more church-related than they were commercial. And gift giving was really reduced because of financial limitations, and also because that wasn't the focus. So we grew up in a very Catholic family, went to midnight mass and all of those things. And Easter and Christmas were big religious events. And I was almost attracted to becoming a cleric, becoming a brother or a priest. I thought about that as a young guy, and I didn't follow through on it. So, does that answer your question?
Oh, yes. Yeah, it does.
Okay.
So, a few extra questions. Do you remember anything about the storming of Normandy? The storming beaches of Normandy?
Well, yes, I remember a lot about that. It is, for me, it was a history lesson. I mean, it wasn't an immediate experience. Although, when I was a student in Paris, I went hitchhiking a lot. And I was hitchhiking in Normandy, and this woman and her adult daughter picked me up on the road and gave me a ride and told me some stories about the war and what the older woman had done when Normandy, what is it, Caen when Caen was being, that's not Caen. Caen is in the south and
Yeah.
Caen is up in Normandy. When the city was being bombed, she was a grammar school teacher, and she took her class out of the city. It was Le Havre, Le Havre. She took her class out of the city of Le Havre and escaped into the countryside, and she had that whole class with her for the duration of the war. And she told me that she had a couple of Jewish boys in her class, and what she did was dress them as girls and let their hair grow long, because the boys were identifiable by the Nazis, because the Jewish boys are all circumcised and French boys are not necessarily. So she had those kids for 4 years, and she told me that after the war, when she could come back to Le Havre, many of their families had been killed, and properties, their homes were damaged and such. So these children were then parceled out to like foster homes, essentially. So I had that connection with Normandy. It was a big revelation to me to know that somebody was that caring and that gutsy, to tough it out for 4 years with a class of kids and no money and just living off the land. So I had that connection.
Okay, what was your reaction to finding out that President Kennedy had been assassinated?
It was devastating. I mean, it truly was devastating. And that happened, it was like the world stopped. I couldn't believe, and I wasn't alone, I couldn't believe that he was dead. And then I got to see Oswald killed live on television. And it was like the end of innocence for me, in a way, to see that go on.
Do you remember what you were doing when it happened, or when you heard about it?
Oh yeah, it was 1963, and I was in graduate school, struggling as graduate students do, and all of a sudden everything just stopped. It came to a screeching halt. It was like, you saw the eclipse the solar eclipse last year. It was of that magnitude. I mean, it just stopped everything. You couldn't believe that it was going on. And it was somewhat frightening, somewhat angering, and all I can say is I felt nonplussed by it, very empty. I felt that death as much or more even than the deaths of my parents.
Wow.
I mean, it was powerful.
Okay, so what was your reaction to the Challenger space shuttle exploding in Florida?
Shock, of course, and a great deal of concern for the kids who were watching this in their classrooms all around the country, because their teacher, or a representative of their teacher, Terry McAuliffe, had been chosen to go up and do the experiment, and she was filled with optimism, and the kids were all excited, and then poof, it was all over. So it was mostly the feeling, well, I was sorry about it, but it was the feeling of concern I had for the children who may have been deeply affected by seeing this.
How did you find out about it?
I actually was watching the launch on TV.
Wow.
And saw the thing explode and then trail off. And at first, the commentators didn't know what it was they were looking at. They thought it might have been releasing a booster rocket or something. And so they quickly found out that it was what it had been, and that became a continuous loop in the news cycle of this same image going over and over and over again. And I kept thinking, these kids, if they didn't see it the first time, surely will have seen it the next 300 times that it's shown. So that was my response to it.
All right. Okay. Last question. What were you doing during the attacks of 9/11?
On 9/11, that was in 2001, and that was 2 years before I retired from Purdue. So I was driving on the highway to go to the gym where I was teaching a course in a body pump. And I had the radio on, and I heard the confusion and the remarks being made, and the first thing I thought was somebody's pulling a replay of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds. I don't know if you know that radio.
No, I don't.
Well, Orson Welles had written a script for radio called War of the Worlds, and it went over the radio like a real event, and people were terrified by it, and there were people panicking and running in the streets and such, and Orson Welles had to come on, and it had to be clarified that this was a dramatization, that it really was all imaginary. So my first thought when I heard the commentators talking about 9/11 was someone's pulling a gag, and that it's not real. And then I got to the gym where I work, and in the lobby there was a big television. There's always a television monitor, and it was playing the the live images of the Twin Towers being hit by jets, by airliners, and people were just totally dumbfounded. And we didn't know at the time that we were looking at that if that was an isolated incident or not, and we found out that it wasn't, that there had been a major plane crash in, I believe, in Pennsylvania, a plane that had been headed for the Pentagon, I believe, or the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and the passengers and the pilots commandeered the plane away from the terrorists and made it crash in a field.
Yeah.
So they gave, that's what real heroism is. They were sacrificing themselves for the greater good, to keep the whole country from going into a state of panic. So the aftermath of 9/11 for me was, I was still teaching at Purdue, and we had a lot of, Purdue has a great number of international students. It has one of the biggest international student communities in the country. And there were some Middle Eastern students, some Arabic-speaking students, who were gleeful about this happening. And they were writing graffiti on the walls with spray paint in the halls of academic building where I taught. And I remember in one class that I was teaching, one of the girls got up and walked to the door, closed the door, and dragged the table, a small lecture table that I used, and she sat on the table and she said, "You're going to have to get through me to get out of this place." And the students were getting ready to beat each other up. And I kind of had to talk them down, and it hit very directly in another way for me. I had a graduate research assistant, no, a teaching assistant, and her mother was a sales representative for some big company, and she was making a sales presentation in the Twin Towers that day that it happened. And she never heard again from her mother. Well, she didn't hear for over a month. And it's because her mother was there, but the explosions had shattered so much glass that the mother had been pelleted with glass, and the explosion knocked her down, and she lost her memory. She didn't know who she was. and of course everything she had with her had been scattered. So she was, she like many other people, was in a hospital being cared for, and it was some time that before she came to her wits about her, and she could identify who she was. And she then, of course, got in touch with her daughter, who was a graduate assistant at Purdue, and a son, I believe, who was a graduate student somewhere else. And then the shock became, the trauma became relived a second time. This girl had gone through some grief about losing her mother. She couldn't locate her anywhere, and she had just assumed that she was dead. And then she got a phone call from the mother, and she said it really was upsetting. I mean, she was glad her mother was not dead, but she was totally shocked and disoriented by it. So that's how it affected me personally. I was teaching an honors English seminar, and it was on a very benign topic. It was on the topic of the court of Louis XIV and the construction of Versailles. It was a general culture course, and the students couldn't relate to it anymore. It's like all of a sudden they could have cared less about what had happened in 17th century France because of what was happening in it was 21st century America. And so I had to make the decision about what to do for those students. And I decided that the syllabus that I had planned was no longer in effect, and that I was going to let those students talk and pull out their reactions and get them aired. And I did that probably for 3 weeks. And I thought, well, you got to do what you've got to do. And I really felt the need for these students to vent, to ventilate and get their tensions out. And then we gradually got back to the course. And it was a big event. It had great impact in Lafayette. And I have a memory of hearing someone knocking at my door at home, and I went to the door, and it was a neighbor from 4 houses down who was just going around knocking on doors and asking if everyone in our family was okay, did we have anyone on the East Coast, etc. She had a son who had gone to high school with your Aunt Colette, and he was at the time was a working actor in television, and he was in New York City, and she hadn't been able to contact him. The communications were really very stressed and strained. It was like the country was temporarily paralyzed for 2 or 3 days. Flights were canceled. It wasn't business as usual. And so this lady became concerned about other people because of what she was dealing with, not knowing what had happened, may have happened to her son. And so she just went door to door and asked the question and gave me a big hug. And when she left, I thought, that's very positive that this lady is doing this.
Yeah.
So 9/11 did impact my life in various ways.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
All right, that's all I have. Thank you for letting me interview you about your life.
Okay.
And your life
More than
events.
you ever wanted to know.
Alrighty.